This demonstration of Photoshop basic tools will introduce you to the paintbrush and pencil tool. We'll talk about the various tool options that are available here in the toolbar. We'll talk about loading brush tips and using your brush palette, as well as utilizing airbrush mode when the brush tool is selected and airbrush mode is selected on your tool options bar. So let's begin. Let's just open up a new file. And let's begin by selecting a brush. Now the brush tool is located here in your tools panel, as well as the pencil tool. I can toggle between the two of them there. So let's select a brush, and now here I can click to open the brush preset picker. I can adjust the size and hardness of my brush. 100% means that the edges will be very crisp. If I move the hardness of the brush downward using this slider, the brush will be softer and softer. And Photoshop tries to mimic this softness of the brush by making anti-aliased edges. Anti-aliasing refers to the way that brushes, or the way that pixels use a gradient from dark to background color, from the foreground color to the background color, which in this case is white. And it attempts by creating pixelated gradients how it's going to make that brush appear to be smooth. So if I click and drag this brush, you can see I have a very soft effect, and that is because I had selected a hardness setting of about 30%. If we zoom in, you can see how the edges are anti-aliased. From the foreground color, which is sort of this teal or turquoise, to white. It anti-aliases by making a gradient of pixels that go from the foreground color into the background color. So that is how Photoshop is able to mimic brush softness. So if I choose the brush tool again, and I increase the hardness of the brush, let's set it to 100% for comparison, you can see now that the brush is laying down a very solid edge. And we can zoom in and look that that's much more solid than the gradient that is produced there. It still does have a little bit of anti-aliasing, but it mimics a much more solid approach. Other options available in the options bar. If you want to bring up the brush palette allows you to see various options for the brush, including tip shape options. You can adjust the size of the brush here, the hardness here. You can also adjust the spacing. As I increase the spacing, and then I apply the brush, you can see that it spaces the shape of the brush further apart. As I decrease the spacing, then it attempts to blend that brush as if it were one solid stroke. You can also change the angle of the brush, which really wouldn't make much difference with a round brush, but let's select a brush that has a bit of an edge to it, for example. And if I change the angle of that brush, now if I increase the spacing, you can kind of see how that changed the angle of the brush. Think of it as if you were holding a calligraphy pen, and that nib on the calligraphy pen, you were holding it at an angle. So it attempts to it allows you to change the angle of the brush. You can also bring up the brush palette under Window and Brush. And you can keep those brush palette options available here in your floating panel options as well. If I decrease the spacing now with this brush, it's like using a flat brush and holding it at an angle. Okay? Other options available here is the opacity settings for the brush. Let me just open up a new document. And I can change the opacity settings for my brush. So let's choose another basic brush. Maybe we'll make it about 50%, somewhere in the middle. Brush size, we'll tone it down or not. Notice as I change the brush size, the cursor changes as I move my cursor over the image window. The cursor changes to reflect the size of that brush. It also reflects the type of brush from the brush presets by showing us the shape of the selected brush. Some of these are textured brushes that I can choose. But let's just talk about the opacity setting for one moment. So I'll select a brush here. And now I've got my color turquoise. I'm going to change my opacity setting to like 50%. And click and hold and drag the mouse. Okay, and that's going against a white background. If I increase the opacity, you can see the difference between brush A at 50% and then stroke B, which was at 100%. Now these options here are for people who have tablets. People, for example, would be using a Wacom tablet, could toggle this on, and so the amount of pressure that they put on the tablet would then be reflected on the image window as they click and held the pen to tablet. This setting here allows you to toggle on or off airbrush mode. Airbrush mode takes your brush, and let's try a larger brush so for this demonstration. I'm going to turn on airbrush mode. I'm going to choose another color. And I'm going to click and hold and I'll spray. It's like working with a spray can, spray paint. And you can change the flow just like you can on an airbrush. If you increase the flow, that's the amount of air pressure that's flowing through the brush. And Photoshop attempts to mimic this. Notice at 100% it's much darker than if I decreased the flow to 14%. And this is great if you wanted to do like spray paint effects or anything of that nature. So you can toggle airbrush mode on or off. Another interesting thing about the tool options menu are the blending modes. Now the blending modes, we won't get into at this time. They'll be mentioned at a later date. But they attempt to mimic the blending modes that are available through photography settings if you were in the dark room, hard light, soft light. And they also reflect the same modes that are available in your layers panel. If you, let's see if we make a new layer and we change the blending mode here, they are the same type of blending modes available in your layers panel. But let's save those blending modes for a later module topic and just keep experimenting with the brushes. Now if I wanted to change to a preset brush, there's a bunch that come standard with Photoshop. I can do that here. And some of the brushes are similar to shapes. This one kind of looks like an aspen leaf. Let's choose like an orange gold of an aspen leaf. And attempt to use this brush. It's kind of hard to see that color for you, I bet. So let me choose something a little darker so that you can see the demonstration of what this brush does. And so it's attempting to lay down what would happen if you saw a bunch of leaves on the ground. And you can change the size of those leaves, and you can update the opacity of those leaves. But it almost looks like the impression that's left from leaves that have been lying there, got rained on, and then blew away. So that, it's kind of interesting what some of these custom brushes do. This one's a maple leaf. And then the options panel, of course, which can be brought up here or under Window and Brush, allows us to change the spacing of these leaves, the size, and then some of the changes that are available, how they scatter. We can turn scattering on and off, and notice what that does to the brush. Shape dynamics, they can all go down as one size, or if you use shape dynamics, it attempts to go from small to large, as if you were putting pressure, natural pressure on the brush, where you put down the brush, add pressure, and then release. And that can be seen on some of these other brushes, how shape dynamics works. It attempts to mimic what you naturally do with the brush when you lay it onto the paper. So I encourage you to play with and experiment with all of the different brushes that are available to you. I encourage you to experiment with changing the size of brushes, adjusting the relative hardness of the edges, and just kind of see what these brushes can do for you. Lots of different effects available. Now the pencil tool is not nearly as interesting or as fun, but it is also found in the same area on your tool options. And I'm just going to open up a new panel here, a new image window, so you can see you can change the size of the pencil. And then it just attempts to mimic what would happen if you were writing with a pencil. You can sign your name. You can change the size of that pencil tip. Extremes. So you can see how that pencil mode works, but it's not nearly as interesting as are all the brushes that are available. In a later module, I'll show you how to bring up the brush panel and create your own custom brush. But for now, work with some of the presets and just see what you can do. Come up with something interesting, and as an added bonus, you're learning by using the different brushes. Now one last tool option here is a click tool preset picker. If I click, there's a drop down menu and there's quite a few preset brushes that I have available to me. For example, the sponge brush attempts to mimic if I had actual sponge in my hand and had dipped it in paint and a little bit of water. It attempts to mimic that. So there's a lot of preset brushes that you can quickly select from here. If you want to add to this list, if your current drop-down list isn't very full, you can use this little arrow and you can scroll down to brushes and you can append some brush presets to what you already have, and that's going to make your list longer and the options available to you stronger. But since I already have quite a few already added, I've got lots of things to play with. So I encourage you to click, drag, lie, cheat, steal, whatever you need to do to learn the various brushes and brush options just to become sort of familiar with what's available. And this concludes the introduction to the brush tool, the pencil tool, and their various options.